The dust of the high plains was a sermon, and Jedediah was its unwilling congregation. It spoke of endings, of things scoured down to the bone, of a son that gave life only to take it back with a fierce and holy avarice. His ranch was a speck of defiant vanity in this vast ochre emptiness, a raw wound of a cabin, a leaning barn, and a corral that held 2 horses thin as ghosts. It was a place a man came not to build a life, but to let one bleed out, slowly, under the indifferent gaze of the sky. He had bought the land for its silence, for the way the wind moved through the grama grass like the sigh of a forgotten god. But the silence was a liar. It was filled with the ghosts of sounds, the crack of a carbine, the scream a man makes when he realizes his soul has just left his body, the shrill, terrified cry of a horse falling in a cloud of gunsmoke. Jedediah had come here to forget the man he was, the blue coat he had worn, the orders he had followed. But memory was in the soil, in the taste of the well water, in the shape of the buttes that stood like solemn, unforgiving judges against the horizon. This evening, the sermon in the dust was different. A storm was coming, not of rain, but of that low, bruised light that bleeds across the prairie just before the stars take dominion. The air was unnaturally still, the kind of quiet that precedes a reckoning. He was on his way back from the creek, a pitiful trickle of water that was the lifeblood of his meager existence, when he saw it. A stain against the pale stones, a disruption in the day's slow, rhythmic death. It was not an animal. Animals bled, but they did not bleed like this. This was a deliberate, almost ceremonial spilling. The blood was dark, nearly black on them. Thirsty river rocks, leading from the water's edge into a thicket of salt cedar. He tasted metal in his mouth, the old, familiar tang of fear. A man alone in this land did not go looking for the source of another's trouble. Trouble here was a contagion, and survival was a practice of radical selfishness. He should have turned, walked back to his cabin, bolted the door, and cleaned his rifle until the world outside his 4 walls ceased to exist. But his feet, those traitors, carried him forward. He moved with a hunter's quiet, his hand resting on the worn grip of the Colt at his hip. The trail was short. In the heart of the cedar grove, where the shadows grew thick and cool, she lay. She was a child. No, not a child. A girl on the precipice of womanhood, her form slender but possessing a strength that even unconsciousness could not fully mask. Comanche, he knew from the fine beadwork on her doeskin dress, the pattern of suns and serpents that was the signature of the Quahati bands who still hunted this territory as if it were the dawn of creation. Her black hair was a spill of ink against the parched earth, matted with blood and pine needles. She was dying. A deep gash ran along her side, a vicious tear that looked like it had been made by the broken tine of a pitchfork or a splintered lance. It was a wound born of chaos, of close, desperate fighting. But what was more alarming was the deeper stain spreading across the front of her dress, originating from her shoulder. A bullet wound, cleaner but more lethal. He knelt, the cracking of his knees the only sound in the universe. Her face, even in its pallor, was a map of fierce pride. High cheekbones, a strong jaw, a mouth that seemed sculpted for defiance. Her skin was the color of fired earth, now cooled by the encroaching chill of death. He saw the faint, pale lines of ritual scars on her forearms, delicate patterns that spoke of sun dances and visions he could never comprehend. His breath caught in his throat. He had seen faces like hers before. He had seen them through a haze of black powder smoke in the flickering, hellish light of burning tipis. He had seen them contorted in fear, in rage, in the final shocking emptiness of death. This was not just a Comanche girl. She was the Comanche girl, the specter that haunted every silent moment of his life, the ghost of every woman and child who had fallen before the relentless advance of the U.S. cavalry. To help her was to invite the whirlwind. Her people would follow. They would not ask questions. They would see a white man, a tabat bow, standing over one of their own, and their vengeance would be as swift and merciless as a prairie fire. To leave her was to commit another murder, to add one more ghost to the legion that already crowded his soul. It was a choice between a quick death and a slow one. His hand trembled as he reached out, not to touch her, but to feel the air around her, as if her spirit might lash out and burn him. He saw something then, clutched in her right hand, held with a grip that death had not yet loosened. It was a small, crudely carved wooden horse, its lines worn smooth with countless hours of anxious touch. A child's toy, a sacred token. A last link to a life that was now draining out of her into the unforgiving Texas dirt. And then her eyelids fluttered. Just once, her lips parted and a sound escaped, a whisper so faint it was more a feeling. Then a sound, a puff of air freighted with a single sacred word. "No Pitzai, my mother." It was not a plea. It was a statement, a final destination. He knew the word. He had heard it cried out in the chaos of a dawn raid years ago. A raid on a village that slept by a creek very much like this one. The memory slammed into him with the force of a physical blow, the smell of burning hides, the thunder of hooves, the high, thin screams. And that word, that name for a mother, whispered and screamed into the bloody morning. He looked up at the sky. A lone hawk circled, its cry a thin, sharp razor slicing through the profound silence. It was a cry of judgment, a cry of witness. He had already been judged. He had already been found wanting. The only question now was the nature of his penance. Jedediah made his choice. With a groan that seemed to rise from the very center of the earth, he slid his arms beneath the dying girl, lifting her from the ground. She was impossibly light, a bundle of shattered grace and fading warmth. As he stood, the small wooden horse fell from her grasp, landing silently in the dust. He hesitated, then bent and retrieved it, tucking it safely into his own pocket. He carried her out of the cedar grove, his steps heavy with the weight of his own history. He was not saving a life. He was carrying his own damnation back to his home, a final, desperate act of atonement in a life that had been defined by sin. The sun had vanished, leaving only a smear of violet and blood along the western rim of the world. By sunrise he knew they would come. The cabin was a cramped sanctuary of shadows and regret. He laid her on his own cot, the only soft place in the entire structure. The rough wool blanket seemed to mock the delicacy of her form. For a moment he was paralyzed, a man standing on the shore of a vast and turbulent sea, knowing he had to swim but terrified of the undertow. The two wounds stared up at him like accusing eyes. The gash on her side was ugly, inflamed, but it was the bullet wound in her shoulder that held the specter of a quick death. It was deep, and she was burning with fever. He worked with a grim, focused desperation. He stripped away the top of her beaded dress, his movements careful, almost reverent, his calloused fingers fumbling with the intricate ties. Her skin was hot to the touch, a dry, dangerous heat. He averted his eyes from her nakedness, a sudden sharp shame rising in him. It was not a feeling of desire, but of violation. He was a white man, a former soldier, and his hands on her felt like a continuation of the violence that had brought her to his door. He was no hero. He was the reason she was here. As he cleaned the wounds with boiled water and whiskey, the memories he fought so hard to keep buried erupted into the quiet room. He was 22 again, his face still smooth with the naivety of a boy from Ohio who thought wearing the blue coat of the cavalry was a noble calling. He remembered the pre-dawn chill, the nervous energy of the horses, the grim-faced orders of Major Crayfield, a man whose soul had been carved out and replaced with a cold, hard stone of righteous hatred. "No quarter," the major had said, his voice like gravel. "We are the wrath of God today, boys." Jedediah had believed him. For a time, he had ridden into that sleeping village with the others, his rifle hot in his hands. But the wrath of God had sounded less like thunder and more like the weeping of women. It had smelled less like righteous fire and more like the coppery stench of butchery. He saw not savages, but families running from the flames, their faces etched with a terror he had never imagined. He saw a young boy, no older than 10, stand his ground with a small bow, his eyes wide with a courage that shamed every man on horseback. Jedediah had lowered his rifle then. He had aimed it at the sky and fired, the recoil a small private penance. It was a gesture of defiance so small it had gone unnoticed by everyone but himself, but it had changed him. It had planted a seed of revulsion in his soul that had grown until it choked out everything else, his patriotism, his ambition, his belief in the inherent goodness of his own kind. He had been cast out not long after, not for his insubordination, which was never discovered, but for the corrosive silence that had taken root in him, a sullen, unmanly grief that made the other soldiers uneasy. He was in exile long before he came to this desolate scrap of land. The girl on his cot was the living embodiment of that morning. She was the consequence of his actions and his inactions. He was tending not just to her wounds, but to the festering wound in his own spirit. He found the bullet. It was lodged against her collarbone, a flattened piece of lid. He probed for it with the tip of a sterilized knife, his jaw clenched, sweat stinging his eyes. The girl moaned, a low, guttural sound that was not of this world. Her body arched in a spasm of agony, and for a terrifying second, her eyes flew open. They were not the eyes of a child. They were ancient, bottomless, filled with a darkness that seemed to hold all the suffering of her people. They looked not at him, but through him, as if seeing the ghost of the blue-coated boy he had been. Then her eyes rolled back and she was gone again, lost to the fever's delirium. He finally extracted the slug, dropping it with a clatter into a tin bowl. It was a .44 caliber round, the kind used in a Colt Peacemaker, the weapon of a rancher, a rustler, a white man. He stitched the wound closed with a needle and gut, his hands surprisingly steady. He had learned this skill not in the army, but from a woman named Elspeth, a preacher's daughter he had known briefly after he left the service. She had a healing touch and a heart full of a grace he felt he could never deserve. She had tried to mend his soul, but it was too broken. He had left her too, unable to bear the weight of her goodness. Now he used the skills she taught him to save the life of a girl his former brothers in arms would have left for the vultures. The irony was a bitter pill. He made a poultice of yarrow and crushed comfrey root, just as Elspeth had shown him, and applied it to her wounds. As he worked, he noticed something else. Under the grime and blood on her dress, near the hem, was a small patch of coarse blue wool. He recognized it instantly. It was the fabric of a U.S. cavalry jacket. He carefully cut it away, his heart pounding a slow, heavy drumbeat against his ribs. Someone else had been there. A soldier. Had he been the one to shoot her? Had she killed him? The silent cabin offered no answers. He took the scrap of blue cloth and the lead slug, walked to the hearth, and dropped them into the flames. He watched them burn, a small futile attempt to erase a history that was written in blood across the entire continent. He sat in the room's only chair as the hours crawled by, watching her. Two ghosts under one roof. He haunted by what he had done. She by what had been done to her. The silence between them was not empty. It was a living thing, thick with unspoken accusations, shared trauma, and the terrifying uncertainty of the coming dawn. She began to mutter in her fever dream. Words. In her own tongue, the Comanche language that sounded like running water and rolling thunder. He recognized names, or what sounded like names, Pia, Tasawi, Makava. They were whispers from a world he had helped to destroy, fragments of a life he could never understand. At one point, she fell silent, and a strange calm settled over her features. She turned her head slightly, her unfocused gaze finding the low burning fire in the hearth. A single tear traced a clean path through the grime on her cheek. She stared at the flames not with fear, but with a kind of terrible, intimate recognition, as if she were watching a loved one being consumed. As if she remembered the fire not as a source of warmth, but as an instrument of annihilation. Their two wounds, one of the flesh and one of the soul, filled the small cabin with a pain so profound it seemed to warp the very air. Jedediah did not feel like a rescuer. He felt like a jailer, guarding the last flickering flame of a life he had no right to touch. He was waiting for the judgment he knew he deserved, and it was sleeping in his bed. The fever held her in its jaws for 2 days. 2 days of Jedediah moving like a wraith through his own home. His world shrunk to the space between the cot and the hearth. He forced broth and willow bark tea between her lips. He bathed her brow with cool water. He spoke to her, not in words, but in low, meaningless hums, the way he would soothe a spooked horse. They were melodies he remembered from his mother, simple, wordless lullabies that felt like the only clean things left in his memory. He was offering her the last vestiges of his own lost innocence. On the 3rd morning, the fever broke. He woke in his chair to find her watching him. The delirium was gone from her eyes. In its place was a stillness that was far more unnerving. It was the calm of an ancient stone, of a deep, dark pool of water. It was a silence that held knowledge. She did not speak. She simply observed him, her gaze missing nothing, the weariness in his face, the tremor in his hands, the tarnished brass buttons on his worn civilian shirt that still hinted at a military cut. Her eyes were not filled with fear or hatred. They were filled with a terrifying, unnerving patience. He offered her a bowl of thin corn mush. She sat up slowly, wincing as the stitches in her side pulled, and took the bowl from him. Her fingers brushed his, and the touch was like a spark of lightning, a jolt of shared history that left him breathless. She ate with a slow, deliberate grace, as if partaking in a sacred rite. The days that followed unfolded in this dreamlike, fragile quiet. They communicated through gesture, through the shared space of the cabin. He would bring in firewood. She would arrange it neatly by the hearth. He would butcher a rabbit. She would watch him, her eyes following the movement of his knife with an unnerving focus. He had buried the tattered remnants of her dress, the one stained with blood and memory. He had given her an old linen shirt of his to wear, which hung on her small frame like a shroud. It felt wrong, another layer of his world forced upon hers. But it was all he had. One afternoon, seeking to fill the crushing silence, he took out the small, carved wooden horse he had retrieved from the creek bed. He had cleaned it, rubbing the dark wood with linseed oil until it gleamed. He held it out to her, an offering, a clumsy apology for all the things he could not say. She looked at the horse, then at him. For a long moment, she did not move. Then slowly, she reached out and took it. She held it in her palm, her thumb stroking its smooth, worn back. A flicker of something pain-love, a memory so sharp it was a physical presence crossed her face. It was the first true emotion he had seen in her since she'd woken. She closed her hand around the carving and held it to her chest, a silent, profound gesture of acceptance. That evening something shifted. The air grew heavy again, charged with the same expectant stillness that had preceded her discovery. Jedediah felt it in his bones, a low hum of anxiety that made the hairs on his arms stand up. She seemed to feel it too. She sat on the floor before the hearth, not looking at the fire, but at the cooled ash from the day before. With a single graceful finger, she began to draw a circle, then a spiral within the circle, then figures, stick-like but imbued with a strange fluid power, men on horses, tippus, a river. It was a map of a memory, a story told in soot and silence. Her story, and he suspected his too. As she drew, a sound began to emanate from her, so low he wasn't sure he was hearing it at first. It was a hum. A soft, mournful, repetitive melody that was less a song and more a vibration. It was the sound of a heart weeping. It rose and fell with the rhythm of her drawing, a private, sacred incantation. He stood frozen, watching her, listening to the sound that seemed to weave itself into the very timbers of the cabin. He had a sudden chilling realization. The song was not for him. It was not for her. It was a call, a signal. She was humming for someone who was listening, someone beyond the walls of this lonely cabin, out in the vast waiting darkness. The quiet before the storm had broken. The dream was ending. He looked out the cabin's single grimy window into the deepening twilight. The land was empty, but he knew, with a certainty that settled in his gut like a cold stone, that they were already there, watching, listening to her song. The world went silent just before dawn. Not the familiar silence of the empty plains, but a heavy, pressing quiet, as if the land itself were holding its breath. The crickets stopped their chirping. The wind died in the tall grass. Jedediah, who had not slept, felt the change in the marrow of his bones. He rose from his chair and walked to the door, his hand instinctively going to the Colt at his hip. Before he let it drop, knowing with absolute certainty how useless it would be, he opened the door a crack. A pale, ethereal fog had rolled in, blanketing the prairie in a soft gray shroud. And in the fog they stood. The first was a single rider, motionless on a paint horse, a silhouette against the nascent light. He was a statue carved from shadow and steel, a Winchester rifle held across his lap. He was not looking at the cabin, but past it, a sentinel guarding a sacred space. Then Jedediah's eyes adjusted, and he saw the others. They were not on horseback. They were on foot, emerging from the mist like spirits rising from the earth. 10, then 20, then more. Warriors, their faces painted not for war, but for solemn ceremony. Black and white stripes, symbols of grief and vengeance. They formed a silent, unwavering arc around his homestead, their presence a physical weight, a pressure that seemed to compress the air in his lungs. They held lances' bows. A few had old rifles. They made no move, no sound. They were simply there. Power, history, judgment. The land, his land, was no longer his. It had been reclaimed. Every rock, every blade of grass, every gust of wind now belonged to them. The door behind him creaked open further. The girl stood there, no longer in his shirt, but in a simple doeskin dress he had not seen before. It was clean, unadorned, the dress of a mourner or an initiate. She must have had it in a bundle he'd missed. Her hair was combed, braided with strips of red cloth. She looked at the silent army before them, and for the first time her face was serene. She was home. From the center of the line of warriors, a man began to walk forward. He was older, his face a testament to 1,000 suns, 1,000 sorrows. His long gray-streaked hair was braided with otter fur. He wore no paint, but his presence commanded more authority than all the armed men combined. This was the chief. He walked not with the arrogance of a conqueror, but with the heavy, measured tread of a man who carries the fate of his people on his shoulders. At his side, his hand resting on the shoulder of a boy of about 14, who walked with him, mirroring his solemn gait. They stopped 20 paces from the cabin door. The chief's eyes, dark and piercing, found Jedediah's. They held no malice, no overt threat. They held something far more terrifying, the weight of a history Jedediah could only begin to comprehend. The world held its breath. The hawk was back, or another one just like it, circling high overhead, its cry the only sound in the universe. It was the cry of a witness come to see the final act. The chief raised his hand, not in greeting, but to command the silence. His gaze never left Jedediah. When he spoke, his voice was not loud, but it carried across the still morning air with the resonant power of a drumbeat. It was a voice that had pronounced judgments, sung death songs, and whispered promises to the gods of the wind and sky. He spoke in English, the words deliberate, each one chosen with the precision of a master carver. You have a thing that is not yours. It was not a question. It was a statement of irrefutable fact. Jedediah's heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. This was it. The moment of reckoning. All the years of running, of hiding in this self-imposed exile, had led to this single terrifying point in time. The girl stepped forward, moving to stand beside Jedediah. She looked at the chief, her father, and then back at the man who had pulled her from the jaws of death. The chief's gaze shifted to her, and for a fleeting instant, a universe of pain and love passed between them. Then his eyes returned to Jedediah, harder now, colder. You touched one of ours. The accusation was absolute. It was a violation of law, of spirit, of the sacred boundary between two worlds. The punishment for such a transgression was death. A slow death. Jedediah knew this. He had seen what they did to men who harmed their women. Fear was a cold knot in his stomach, but something else rose to meet it, a sense of profound, terrible relief. The sentence was at hand. The waiting was over. He did not beg. He did not raise his weapon. He did not try to explain. His entire life since that bloody morning raid had been an explanation whispered to ghosts. Now he would give his answer. To the living. With a slowness that felt like a prayer, Jedediah dropped to one knee in the dust. He released the useless pistol from his belt and let it fall to the ground. He bowed his head, exposing the back of his neck. It was not an act of fear. It was an act of atonement, an admission of a debt that could only be paid in blood. He was surrendering not to their power, but to their justice. The silence that followed was the most profound he had ever known. It was the sound of a soul laid bare, awaiting the final righteous blow. They did not kill him. The chief, whose name he would later learn was Tasawi, or White Knife, watched his act of submission with an unreadable expression. He took another step forward, the boy at his side, until he stood directly over the kneeling Jedediah. The shadow of the Comanche leader fell across him like a shroud. Jedediah kept his head bowed, his eyes fixed on the dust, waiting. He could feel the collective gaze of 20 warriors on him, a physical pressure that was heavier than any stone. Tasawi spoke again, his voice lower now, more intimate, a sound meant only for Jedediah and the spirits that listened in the quiet. Air, you carry 2 ghosts, the chief said. The one you saved and the one you made. Jedediah's blood ran cold. It was not an accusation, it was a pronouncement. They knew, somehow they knew who he was, what he had been. Stand, Tasawi commanded. Jedediah rose slowly, his legs unsteady. He finally met the chief's gaze. In those dark eyes, he saw not the promise of a swift death, but the complex, agonizing landscape of memory. 10 winters ago, Tasawi began, his voice a low, chanting cadence. A blue-coat soldier raid fell upon our winter camp on the Peace River. They came at dawn when the people slept. They burned our lodges, they slaughtered our horse herds. They called themselves the Wrath of God. The words struck Jedediah with the force of a physical blow. The Peace River. He remembered the name from Major Crayfield's briefing. He squeezed his eyes shut, the images flooding back, the orange glow of burning hide, the black smoke against the pink sky, the screams. My wife, Pia, the name the girl had whispered in her fever, was killed that morning. She died, trying to lead the children to the safety of the riverbank. My daughter, the one who stands beside you, was with her. I saw them fall. I thought they were both lost to the spirit world. He paused, and the silence was filled with the crushing weight of that decade-old grief. We found the body of my wife. We did not find the body of my daughter. For 10 winters. We have mourned her. We sang her death songs. We cut our hair. We carried her memory as a stone in our hearts. He turned his gaze to the girl. Her name is Tavakiana. It means sun's shadow. She followed the light of her mother, and when that light was extinguished, she became a shadow, lost between worlds. The first shocking twist landed on Jedida's soul. This was not just any girl. This was the daughter of the chief, a child believed dead, a ghost returned to the living. His cabin had not been a shelter. It had been a vessel for a miracle. But a spirit does not bleed from a white man's bullet, Tosawi said, his eyes snapping back to Jedediah. A spirit does not need its wounds stitched by the hand of its enemy. Tell me, soldier, how is it that you are here, on this land, and she is alive? This was the test, the true reckoning. He had to speak the truth, every last ugly, shameful piece of it. I was there, Jedediah said, his voice hoarse, broken. I was one of the bluecoats. I rode with Major Crayfield. A low murmur rippled through the line of warriors. Their hands tightened on their weapons. The boy at Tosawi's side stared at Jedediah with a sudden blazing hatred. I was young, Jedediah continued, forcing the words out, forcing himself to meet the chief's unflinching gaze. I thought I was serving a cause. I saw your wife, your daughter. They were running. Another soldier, he raised his rifle to, he couldn't finish the sentence. The shame was a physical thing, choking him. I was supposed to fire. The major's orders were no quarter, but I couldn't. I saw the boy, another boy, with a bow. He was rambling, the memories chaotic, disjointed. I fired my weapon into the air. The soldier next to me was distracted for a moment. He fired, but his aim was off. He hit your wife. But your daughter, she had already fallen. She tumbled down the riverbank into the thick brush. I thought she was dead. I saw her fall, and I thought she was dead like all the others. This was the second twist, the one that redefined his entire life. The act he had carried for a decade as his one secret, futile moment of insubordination, the act that had filled him with shame for his own cowardice, was not a moment of failure. It was the moment that had saved her. His refusal to obey, his single, insignificant gesture of defiance, had created this slim margin of chaos that allowed Tavakiana to survive the initial volley. She had been wounded, lost, and had somehow survived in the wilderness, a ghost child living on the edges of the world until another act of white violence, the recent gunshot, had finally brought her down. Tosawi listened, his expression unchanging. But a new light flickered in the depths of his eyes. He had not known this detail. He had only known that his daughter, who had been missing and presumed dead, had reappeared in the care of a white man. Tavakiana stepped forward. She looked at her father, and then she spoke for the first time, her voice clear and strong, holding none of the fragility he had nursed. "He speaks the truth," she said in Comanche, and the boy translated, his voice filled with reluctance. "I remember the face of the soldier who did not shoot. In my fever, I saw it again. It was his face, but younger. When I woke, I saw the same eyes. He is the man from the river." She then looked directly at Jedediah. "I have seen a vision," she said, and the boy translated again. "In my dream, the Great Spirit showed me this man. He was standing between my body and a vulture. He did not save me from the first death, the death of my mother, but he was sent to save me from the second." The revelation hung in the air, epic, ancestral, worthy of myth. He was not her savior. He was an instrument. A piece of a story so much larger than himself, a story woven by forces he could not name. He had been chosen not for his goodness, but for his sin, for the wound in his soul that mirrored the wound in their people. A long silence followed. The sun was higher now, burning away the last of the fog. The world was stark and clear. Tasawi looked from his daughter to Jedediah, his gaze weighing 10 years of grief against this single impossible moment of grace. "You did not pull the trigger that killed my wife," the chief said slowly. "But you rode with those who did. You wore their coat. You ate their bread. The debt is not paid." He took a step back. "But the manner of its payment has changed." He turned and gave a sharp command in his own tongue. 2 warriors came forward. They did not take Jedediah by force. They stood on either side of him, waiting. The invitation was clear. He was to go with them. His fate was not to be decided here, in the dust in front of his cabin. It was to be decided in the heart of their world, by a fire that had been waiting for him for 10 long years. They walked for hours, deeper into the broken, sun-blasted country that the Comanche called home. Jedediah walked in the center of the silent procession, a prisoner who was not bound, a guest who was not welcome. His cabin, his failed attempt at a life, vanished behind a rise in the land, and he felt as though he had stepped out of time itself. The world of fences and deeds and property lines dissolved, replaced by an ancient landscape of rock and sky that held its own laws, its own brutal truths. The Comanche camp was hidden in a shallow, cottonwood-choked canyon, invisible until you were upon it. It was not the sprawling, confident village of his memories. This was a smaller, more transient place, the camp of a people on the run, a people clinging to the last vestiges of their freedom. The tipis were weathered, the horse herd lean but tough. Yet, there was an undeniable dignity to the place, a resilience that was as hard and unyielding as the land itself. As they entered the camp, the people emerged from their lodges, women, children, old men. Their faces were a mixture of curiosity, grief, and suspicion. They stared at Jedediah, their eyes holding the shared memory of 100 massacres, 1,000 broken treaties. He was the embodiment of their sorrow, the walking symbol of their long, slow dying. He kept his eyes down, his heart a cold, heavy stone in his chest. Tavakiana walked beside her father, the chief. The reunion was a quiet, solemn affair, marked by tears and the low, keening songs of the women. They touched her, her hair, her face, as if to confirm that she was not a spirit, that she was flesh and blood. She was a miracle, a seed of hope. In a barren season, Jedediah was taken to a tipi near the center of the camp and told to wait. The 2 warriors stood guard outside. He sat on the bare ground, the sounds of the camp washing over him, the murmur of the Comanche tongue, the cry of a baby, the nicker of a horse. These were the sounds of the village he had helped destroy. He was a ghost at his own crime scene. As dusk fell, a fire was lit in the center of the camp. A large, ceremonial fire that painted the canyon walls in flickering shades of orange and red. The steady, resonant beat of a single drum began, a rhythm that seemed to sync with his own terrified heartbeat. He believed it was his funeral. This was the ordeal. He would be brought before that fire, before the assembled tribe, and they would exact their justice. He had prepared himself for it, accepted it. It was the only fitting end to his story. One of the warriors entered the tipi. "The chief calls for you," he said. Jedediah followed him out into the night. The entire tribe was gathered around. The fire, their faces illuminated, stark and serious. Tasawi stood before the flames, his daughter Tavakiana at his side. He was led to the edge of the circle, opposite the chief. The drumming stopped. The silence that fell was absolute, broken only by the crackle and hiss of the fire. "Tavebo," Tasawi's voice boomed across the circle. "White man, you came to our land with a gun in your hand and a ghost in your heart. You took a life from us. But the spirits of this land, in their mysterious ways, used your single moment of doubt to preserve another." He gestured to Tavakiana. She stepped forward, her eyes on the fire. She began to walk towards it, her steps slow and deliberate. Jedediah's heart seized. It was a sacrifice. They were going to offer her to the fire, a purification rite, a way to cleanse the taint of his touch, of her time in his world. It was a horror beyond anything he had imagined. He acted without thinking. He lunged forward, shouting, "No, don't!" The warriors at his side seized him instantly, their grips like iron. He struggled against them, his voice raw with desperation. "Take me, punish me, not her, it was my fault." He was begging for the punishment he had expected, the death he felt he deserved. He was offering his own life in exchange for hers. A strange thing happened. A low murmur went through the crowd. But it was not of anger. It was of something else. Awe, surprise. Tasawi raised a hand, and the warriors holding Jedediah loosened their grip, though they did not release him. Tavakiana stopped her walk towards the fire. She turned and looked at him, and for the first time she smiled. It was a small, sad, knowing smile. Tasawi spoke, his voice laced with a strange new tone. "You misunderstand, white man. You see with the eyes of a conqueror. You see death and sacrifice. We see a new beginning. This was not a funeral. It was a naming. My daughter was lost to us," the chief declared, his voice ringing with power. "She was a shadow. The boy who was to be her husband died in the sickness of the last winter. Her path was gone, but you found her. You brought her back from the edge of the spirit world. You, who were part of the storm that took her, became the unlikely vessel of her return. This is a powerful sign. A new path must be made." Tavakiana walked not into the fire, but to stand beside it. She held her hands out to the heat, her face illuminated by the flames. She began to chant, a song that was not mournful but powerful, a song of identity, of rebirth. The irrational mercy Jedediah had begged for was being granted, but in a form he could never have conceived. They were not giving him peace. They were giving him something far heavier. Tasawi walked over to where Jedediah stood, flanked by the two warriors. He looked deep into Jedediah's eyes, a look of profound, sorrowful understanding. "A man who takes a life from the people owes a life to the people," he said. "You have no life to give. Your own is forfeit. But you can be a guardian of a life. You have been marked by this event. You cannot return to your world. You cannot become one of us. You will stand between." He reached out and placed his hand on Jedediah's shoulder. "We will not give you a weapon. We will not give you a wife. We will not give you a horse. We give you a name, a burden." Tavakiana finished her chant. She turned from the fire and walked to her father's side. She looked at Jedediah, her eyes clear and deep. She reached out and placed her palm flat against his chest, over his heart. Then she bowed her head. It was not a gesture of subservience. It was a gesture of profound, heartbreaking respect. A recognition of the strange, terrible, and sacred bond that now existed between them. Tasawi spoke the name, and it echoed in the sudden silence of the canyon. "We name you Namafasakoteka, the one who stands alone. You will be our watcher. On the edge of the dying world. You will be the silence that warns us of the coming noise. This is your life now. This is your payment." It was not forgiveness. It was a sentence, a life sentence. He was not to be a bridge, a happy fantasy of two worlds joined. He was to be a wall, a lonely sentinel, bound forever to the people he had wronged, his life no longer his own, but an offering, a living monument to their pain and to their astonishing capacity for a justice that transcended simple vengeance. He did not return to his cabin. It was burned. Not in anger, but in ritual. The place where Tavakiana had been brought. Back from the dead, the place tainted by his presence, had to be cleansed from the earth. He watched the flames consume the raw timbers of his failed life, feeling not loss, but the strange, terrifying lightness of a man who has nothing left to lose. He was given a blanket, a knife, and a water skin. He was shown the boundaries of the territory he was now tasked to watch. A vast, lonely stretch of mesas and arroyos that marked the fluid, ever-shrinking border between the Comanche hunting grounds and the relentless encroachment of the white world. His job was simple and impossible. He was to watch, to listen, to be the first to see the surveyor's stakes, the first to hear the rumble of the railroad crews, the first to spot the blue coats of the cavalry riding with the sun at their backs. He was to be a warning, a silent alarm. When he saw them, he was to make a signal, a fire on a high butte, a pattern of stones in a dry river bed, and then he was to vanish. He was not to fight. He was not to speak. His existence was to be whisper on the wind. He became a ghost, a creature of the twilight and the dawn. He learned the language of the land in a way he never had as a rancher. He learned to read the flight of birds, the tracks of animals, the mood of the sky. He ate what he could find: roots, grubs, the occasional snake or rabbit he could trap. He grew gaunt, his skin burned dark by the sun, his hair long and wild. The man named Jedediah ceased to exist. He was only Nuh-Kagio-Tah, the name a constant reminder of his purpose, his penance. Sometimes he would see them. From a high ridge he would spot the Comanche, a hunting party moving like a phantom. Through the broken land, he would see Tavakiana riding tall and proud, her laughter carrying faintly on the wind. She never looked his way. She never acknowledged his presence, but he knew she knew he was there. His lonely vigil was part of her story now, the final chapter of her return. He was her shadow, just as she had once been her mother's. He was not one of them. He would never share their fire, never hear their stories, never know the comfort of their community. And he could never return to the world of white men who would see him as a renegade, a traitor, a savage. He was utterly, completely alone, suspended between two worlds, belonging to neither. Years passed. The lines on his face deepened into a map of his solitude. He saw the surveyors come, and he made his signal. He saw the railroad crews, and he made his signal. Once he saw a cavalry patrol, their blue coats a familiar, sickening sight, and he climbed the highest mesa and built his fire, the smoke a stark, lonely prayer against the vast, empty sky. Each time the Comanche would retreat, melting away into the harsh interior of the plains, surviving for another season, another year, because of the lonely man who watched for them. One winter, a group of buffalo hunters, ruthless men with long-range Sharps rifles, pushed deep into the territory. They were not soldiers or settlers. They were agents of extermination, and they were killing the last of the herds the Comanche depended upon. Jedediah watched them from the rocks, his heart a cold, hard knot of fury. His duty was only to watch, to warn. But this was different. This was not the slow creep of fences and plows. This was a direct assault on the very soul of the people. He followed them for days, a phantom they never saw. He watched them make their camp, heard their coarse laughter, and their boasts of the hundreds of animals they had slaughtered, leaving the carcasses to rot on the plains. In that moment, something inside him broke. The watcher became a warrior. He waited until they slept, the night moonless and cold. He had no gun, only his knife, his knowledge of the land, and a rage that had been simmering for a lifetime. He did not kill them all. That was not his goal. He was an instrument of terror, not of massacre. He slit the throats of their horses, sending the survivors fleeing into the night. He destroyed their wagons, smashed their water barrels, and set fire to their supply of ammunition. He moved through their camp like a vengeful spirit, a whirlwind of silent, focused destruction. When he was done, he vanished back into the rocks, leaving behind a scene of chaos and fear. The hunters, stranded and terrified, would tell a story of a wild man, a demon of the plains who struck without sound and disappeared without a trace. They would not come back. He knew what he had done. He had broken the terms of his sentence. He had acted, not just watched. He had killed, even if it was only horses. He had brought violence back to the land. He walked to the sacred canyon, the place of the naming fire, and waited. He knew they would come for him. He had fulfilled his purpose, and now, his life was truly forfeit. They came at dawn, just as they had all those years ago. Tasawi, older now, his face a mask of deep sorrow, stood before him. Tavakiana was with him, her own face unreadable. "You have broken the law of your name," Tasawi said, his voice heavy. "You have shed blood." "I have," Jedediah said. His own voice was a stranger to him, a dry rasp. "The hunters will bring the soldiers now," the chief said. "Your act of war will bring a greater war to our doorstep." "I know," Jedediah replied. "That is why I am here. Let them find me. Let them believe it was one of you. But let them find me alone. Let the story end with me." He was offering himself up one last time, a final desperate attempt to shield them. Tasawi looked at him, a long searching look. He saw not a white man, not an enemy, but a man who had paid his debt in the cruelest currency of all, solitude. He turned and spoke to Tavakiana in their tongue. The words were quiet, full of love and regret. She nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. She stepped forward and placed her hand on Jedediah's chest, just as she had done by the fire. "Your name is no longer the one who stands alone," she said, her voice a whisper. "Your name is now Takapi, he who gave his heart." Tasawi and the others turned and walked away, leaving him there as the sun rose over the canyon rim. He was alone, but for the first time in his life, he was not lonely. He had a new name. He had a final purpose. He did not have to wait long. The cavalry came, led by the surviving hunters. They found him sitting by a small fire, waiting for them. They saw a wild, gaunt figure, a white man gone savage. They saw no remorse in his eyes, no fear. They saw only a calm, unyielding peace. They did not take him prisoner. Later, when the soldiers were gone, Tavakiana returned to the canyon. She found his body, and she and the other women performed the proper rites. They wrapped him in a new buffalo robe and placed him in a high crevice in the rocks, facing the rising sun. They did not mourn him as one of the people, but they honored him as a man who had fulfilled a sacred, terrible destiny. On the canyon wall, below the place where he was laid to rest, she painted a simple story in red ochre. A lone figure standing between a village and a storm. It was not a monument. It was a memory, a whisper left for the wind and the sky. A final haunting epitaph written on the land itself. He gave what the others never did: time and blood and silence.